For 36 years, he survived everything. Assassination attempts, sanctions that strangled his economy, revolutions that didn't quite happen. A generation of Iranians who hated him openly and paid for it privately. The slow dismantling of every proxy he had ever built. And an international community that talked endlessly about removing him and never quite managed it. He survived all of it. And then, on a Saturday morning in February 2026, during the holy month of Ramadan, two countries decided that patience was over. On February 28, 2026, Ali Khamenei, Supreme Leader of Iran, self-declared representative of divine authority, was killed in a joint airstrike operation by the United States and Israel. The man who had spent 36 years making himself untouchable had, it turned out, a compound. A compound has coordinates. Coordinates can be targeted. The rest is history. Very, very recent history. To understand how this moment arrived, you have to understand what the years before it looked like. Khamenei's death came at a time when Iran was arguably at its weakest since he took power in 1989. Decades of Western sanctions had already left the country isolated and economically battered before U.S. and Israeli strikes in June 2025 dealt his rule a severe blow. That earlier conflict, the 12-day war of June 2025, was the beginning of the end. After it, Khamenei became increasingly reclusive. The bunker in his compound was so deep the elevator took more than 5 minutes to reach it. Wikipedia. Think about that image for a moment. The supreme leader of 85 million people riding a 5-minute elevator into the earth every day just to survive. Power, at its most desperate, looks like a very long elevator ride. Meanwhile, the chain of events triggered by the October 7, 2023 attacks on Israel by Hamas had shattered the image of Iran as an impenetrable and defiant regional power. Iran's network of proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, had been systematically weakened. NPR. The axis of resistance, which Khamenei had spent decades assembling like a geopolitical insurance policy, was paying out nothing. The nuclear talks, his last remaining diplomatic leverage, collapsed on Thursday, February 26th. 2 days later, the bombs fell. If you find yourself wondering how the most powerful theocrat in the Middle East ended up with no allies, no proxies, and no functional air defense, this channel will keep explaining exactly how civilizations dismantle themselves. Subscribe. It's an ongoing series. Before we get to the end, the man deserves more than a headline. Khamenei was born in 1939 in Mashhad, Iran's holiest city. He became a Shiite Muslim cleric at a young age, an activist before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, helping organize protests against the Shah and serving time in prison for it. He was also a target for the new Islamic regime's opponents and escaped an assassination attempt in 1981 that left his right arm permanently useless. CNN. He knew from personal experience what it felt like to be hunted. He spent the rest of his life ensuring no one could do it again. When Khomeini died in 1989, Khamenei was a mid-level cleric who lacked the religious credentials expected of a supreme leader. He knew it himself. He didn't have the prestige or the gravitas to be the successor to the founder of the Islamic Republic, NPR. And yet, the system needed someone loyal, someone who could be managed. They chose the man they thought was manageable. History's oldest miscalculation. What they got instead was a survivor's instinct operating at national scale. With the help of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Khamenei built up his power base to become the longest-serving leader in the Middle East, increasingly appropriating all the levers of power into his own hands and sidelining everyone else. He was not an idealist. He was not, despite the theological costuming, primarily a religious man in any spiritual sense. He was a political animal who had learned from imprisonment and attempted murder and institutional doubt that the only safety was total control. To his supporters, he was the fearless guardian of the revolution. To his critics, Iranian and foreign alike, he was a feared tyrant bent on crushing opposition while keeping his country isolated from the world. Both descriptions were accurate. That was the point. Here is what Khamenei actually built over 36 years, and why its sudden collapse matters. He had the final word on every major policy: the military, The judiciary, the nuclear program, the elections, which were held with all the competitive tension of a tournament where he had already selected the finalists. His close ties to the Revolutionary Guards allowed Iran's military to develop a vast commercial empire controlling large parts of the economy, while ordinary Iranians struggled to get by. He also built what he called the axis of resistance, proxy groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, designed to project power at his enemy's doorstep and deter a direct attack on Iranian soil. It was, as deterrent strategies go, genuinely sophisticated. For 3 decades, it worked. Iran could bleed its enemies at a distance without ever formally going to war. The supreme leader remained untouchable, geographically, legally, militarily. And then, one by one, the proxies were dismantled, the air defenses were struck, the nuclear facilities were damaged, and the CIA spent months learning his schedule. Strategic patience, it turns out, has a termination date. The trigger for the February 28th strikes appeared to be the failure of the latest round of nuclear talks on Thursday. They also reflected dramatic changes that had left Iran's leadership in its weakest position since the Islamic Revolution nearly half a century ago. Military Times, for months before the attack, the CIA had been tracking the locations and patterns of Khamenei. They learned that a meeting of senior officials was to take place with his attendants. The United States and Israel prepared to launch the strikes at the moment when Khamenei would meet with his senior advisors. The man who had ridden a 5-minute elevator to safety every day had, on this particular Saturday, attended a meeting. Meetings are predictable. Predictability in the age of precision intelligence is fatal. Some of the first strikes appeared to hit near the offices of the 86-year-old Khamenei. Satellite imagery confirmed his compound was severely damaged. Military Times, Iranian state media, initially denied everything. The foreign ministry stated he was safe and sound, while news agencies reported he was steadfast and firm in commanding the field. This is what desperate information management looks like in its final hours, insisting the building is still standing while the rubble is visible from orbit. Early the following morning, Iranian state media confirmed it. The broadcaster reportedly broke down in tears. The supreme leader had reached martyrdom. 36 years. Over. What followed was the specific chaos of a system that had been engineered around one man's survival and had made no serious plans for his absence. As the position of supreme leader carries no officially appointed successor, the role of vice supreme leader having been abolished in 1989, Iran immediately faced a succession crisis. An interim leadership council was announced at Khamenei's funeral, comprising the president, the head of the judiciary, and a senior jurist. The IRGC, the institution Khamenei had spent 3 decades empowering, immediately began maneuvering for a permanent appointment, which is what happens when you build a system around loyalty to a person rather than loyalty to a principle. The moment the person disappears, everyone who served the person starts serving themselves. The Iranian public responded with something that no state broadcaster could manage or contain. Celebrations erupted across multiple cities: Isfahan, Karaj, Kermanshah, Shiraz, and others. Iranians went into the streets to mark the death of the man who had governed them for most of their lives. Simultaneously, Iranians mourned, loyalists wept, missiles were fired at American bases across the region. A country of 85 million people, expressing every possible human emotion at once. United in the end only by the fact that they all lived under the same man, and now, suddenly, didn't. This is what the end of a 36-year reign looks like. Not a clean transition, not a legacy secured, just noise in every direction all at once. Here is the uncomfortable part. Khamenei did not fall because of the Iranian people, the people he spent decades suppressing, monitoring, shooting, and imprisoning. He fell because 2 foreign governments decided on a Thursday when nuclear talks failed that the calculation had changed. The Iranian protesters of 2009, of 2019, of 2022, who died in the streets for the possibility of change, did not remove him. Precision missiles did. American intelligence did. Whether that is justice or simply a different kind of imposition is a question Iran will be arguing about for a generation, possibly longer. What is certain is this: Khamenei's killing plunges the Islamic Republic into the most serious crisis since its establishment, with no clear succession, a decimated military chain of command, and an IRGC that is simultaneously the most powerful institution in the country and the most distrusted. The system he built to make himself permanent has no architecture for his absence. Every brick was load-bearing. Every institution was designed to serve the supreme leader, not to outlast him. This is what 36 years of consolidation actually produces, a structure so dependent on one person that removing that person does not weaken the state. It dissolves the logic of the state entirely. He was not just the leader of Iran. He was, by his own careful design, the reason Iran worked the way it worked. And now the country must decide. Under bombardment, under uncertainty, under the watching eyes of a region holding its breath, what it wants to be when the man who defined it for 36 years is no longer there to answer that question for them. If you've been following along, and if this kind of history matters to you, the subscribe button exists. This story is not over. It is, in fact, only beginning. History does not end with the removal of the man at the top. It just finally gets permission to begin. The greatest lie power ever tells is that it is permanent. The second greatest lie is that removing it is the same thing as freedom.